Hello, this is Mark Galeotti of the Institute of International Relations in Prague, currently speaking to you from Moscow, hence the wallpaper. So at the moment we have the spectacle of US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson meeting his Russian counterpart Lavrov, and as a result of the consequent motorcade, just outside my window, Kutuzovsky, one of the major arteries going into central Moscow, is completely jammed. And in some ways, that's actually a fairly good metaphor for the current state of Russian policy. The degree to which it is gridlocked, to a large extent, because it's not quite sure where to go. Let's start with foreign policy. The initial signs clearly are that there is not going to be any great deal. In the early conversations between Lavrov and Tillerson, essentially the Russians just doubled down. They made it clear that they were still backing Assad. They were refusing, despite the evidence to the contrary, to accept that the chemical weapons attack last week was in fact carried out by the Syrian forces, and they described the consequent American cruise missile attack as illegal under international law, as if the rest of this war wasn't. But the problem is this: at the same time, the Russians are acutely, deeply aware that what is happening at the moment is their worst nightmare, is the nightmare that they had on the morning after Trump was elected. And that is this. This is an American administration they cannot predict. After this point, after all, they had always relied on the fact that they could play the role of the unpredictable one, because they felt, with considerable grounds, that they had identified the real red lines of US policy and they knew what the Americans would do in response. I think it's very clear that the Trump administration is going to be rather different. Not only had they very little sense of what the kind of strategic narrative behind policy is, because, frankly, there's very little evidence that there is one. But secondly, this is also not an administration which will feel the need to telegraph its moves in advance, and not an administration that has any problem about using military force. So for all these reasons, they're suddenly now finding themselves in a very reactive role. They honestly don't know what to do, and therefore, as a result, they're just falling back on the old playbook, a playbook which is frankly of increasingly less utility. And I think although there was clearly some hope here that Tillerson would come with some kind of grand plan and some kind of grand deal, he doesn't. The White House is neither cares enough nor is unified enough to offer anything of the sort. And so the Russians are still stuck. They're trying to assert themselves in a world that will all of a sudden become much more hostile to them. And this point about essentially a lack of a real blueprint as to where to go forward, that actually is something that applies across the board here in Moscow. First of all, let's take a look at domestic policy. We have had the opposition figure Alexei Navalny, who, after causing some really quite surprisingly effective protests, was then imprisoned for 15 days. And then he was let out. Now, they still clearly haven't decided, can they possibly allow him to run for president? The odds are not. But nor are they willing to actually go after him and really sort of hound him, persecute him, put him in prison and throw away the key. So probably what we'll see is that their election strategy will be the usual thing. A certain amount of pressure, a certain amount of fake candidates to try and just sort of create the illusion of a real competition. But essentially, they just really want to get through it and win. Thoughts that there was going to be some kind of grand, triumphal electoral coronation of Putin, I think, have been put to one side. Meanwhile, the economy continues to be in trouble. Yes, of course, the economy is beginning to improve. Its GDP is slowly crawling up. But the point is this: there is a need for fundamental reform. And it has to be said that no one I've met here in Moscow is willing to challenge that. No one does not believe that Russia needs to diversify, needs to address the absolutely systematic corruption and embezzlement at the heart of much of government expenditure, and just generally needs to move into the 21st century. The trouble is, to do that will take serious political will, and it will take a willingness to challenge existing interests amongst the oligarchs and amongst the sort of senior figures within the government. And so once again, no one is willing to do it. And so, well, they're back to the usual playbook once again. So whether we're talking about foreign policy, whether we're talking about domestic political policy, or whether we're talking about economic policy, at the moment, frankly, Russia is as gridlocked as Kutuzovsky Prospect out there. And yes, it's not going to lead to any kind of imminent collapse. This is stagnation, nothing else. But on the other hand, what this does mean is, I think, frankly, the creative energies of the Putin administration have been shown to have been spent. Yes, Putin is going to be re-elected next year. Yes, he probably will, in that period of his next 6-year term, identify some kind of successor candidate he feels he can trust. But ultimately, unless there is really some quite substantial change, Russia is slowly but inexorably grinding down. Thanks very much. This is Mark Galeotti from Moscow.